first president from Southern California and the first to move advertising and PR people into his high command. And not just for the campaign. It was also his discovery that you could use the same people with the same skills, people like Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, with their enemies lists and provocateur tactics during the course of the presidency as a whole, so that you could produce what one writer has called the permanent campaign, which has been the kind of presidency as we know it. A combination of polling, image-making, and popularity-building strategy that Reagan developed to a high art, and I think the incumbent right now isn't doing very bad at it at all. So in other words, gradually we have the pattern which has become normal now. Meta coverage for the cognoscenti, spurious pageantry for the majority. The McLaughlin Group for the know-it-all, Oprah or Morton Downey Jr., as your preference goes, for the know-nothing. The interesting and I think important element in all this, and the part I really want to focus on now, is the fact that as the spectacle becomes more scripted and more routine, and here the nominating conventions are a perfect example of that. They're so predictable now. More of the audience turns off. So that one of the consequences of the way in which politics is covered these days is political withdrawal. On the one hand, pseudo-sophistication. If you watch enough McLaughlin groups, you can get to feel like you're an insider, a prognosticator. But increasingly, people turn off. So that the pundits and correspondents who were involved in the meta discourse end up taking part in a kind of circular conversation. In other words, savviness is the tribute that a depoliticized culture pays to the expectations and pleasures of democracy. Middle-class outsiders want to be in the know, while the poor, and increasingly the young, withdraw further and don't even vote. So that politics becomes a business for insiders and professionals, while the rest of us become voyeurs of our political fate, or enragés in a sort of free-floating, scattered way, so that the form in which people feel most comfortable apparently now in talking about political issues is the talk show or the sort of television show in which people yell at each other. These sentiments can even be mobilized politically. You may remember that, I guess it was last year, at the time of the congressional pay raise, that talk show hosts, radio talk show hosts around the country started publicizing the fax numbers of members of Congress. And people flooded those offices with faxes and succeeded in stopping the pay increase. Of course, that was a much easier act to mobilize on than against a more elusive, although infinitely more costly abomination like the savings and loan crisis, or for that matter, the funding of campaigns by the corporate rich. I mentioned before Ron Lembo's research about how people watch television, and I want to close on a reasonably dire, but I think arguably warranted dire note, namely the point that increasingly it seems to be young people who are among the disconnected. The question is whether there's a causation here. It's true that the young are more likely to pay attention to disconnected images, to switch channels, to watch more than one program at once, and to spin off into fantasies derived from images. The young are also the least likely to read newspapers. The question is whether a fascination with speed, with cutting, 10-second bites, 1-second scenes, and out-of-context images suggests less tolerance for the rigors of serious political argument and the tedium of modern political life. Is it true that the attention span is shrinking? And if so, is television the cause? Is there, as some cynics would argue, an MTV generation? Well, take disheart from the fact that many political professionals believe that the answer is yes. Certainly the facts about, for example, newspaper reading are unignorable. In 1967, a very good survey disclosed that 73% of the people polled said they read a newspaper every day. 1967. By 1988, that percentage had declined to 51%. That's a decline of a third. During the same period, if you look at just the 18 to 29-year-olds, the number of everyday readers had dropped from 60% to 29%, or more than half. If you look at the young, you see especially a disproportionate number of readers of USA Today and of the papers that seek to emulate it. It used to be true, moreover, that younger people didn't read papers so much, but as they got older, they did. But that apparently also seems no longer to be true. And newspapers are experiencing this as a crisis and are trying desperately to figure out how they can run sort of teen features and so on to get young people to get back into the television habit. Now, I don't want to defend newspapers as they exist, far from it. But I do want to wonder out loud, and I'm going to end on an inconclusive note, I do want to wonder out loud whether we can be comfortable with a political situation in which the political parties are comfortable managing the sort of symbol management or conducting the sort of symbol management I was talking about, while the demand for serious, or what is laughably these days called in-depth coverage, seems to be rather little, and the more bombastic and thrilling, chilling the coverage, as during the Persian Gulf crisis, the more people are drawn to what they consider to be their major source of news, namely 22-minute television broadcasts. Without wanting to come to any conclusion, I simply want to wonder what sort, or at what point we will no longer be able to flatter ourselves by maintaining that we're involved in something that can really be called democratic politics. I know that ignorance is sometimes a defense against powerlessness, and that people screen the world away when they feel that there's no way they could possibly act on what they know, so that in a certain way ignorance is bliss, or at least it's more blissful than knowledge. But what is disturbing is not ignorance as such, it's the coupling of ignorance and power. And the fact is that despite the end of the Cold War, the United States remains the most powerful military force in history. It's capable of doing the greatest damage of any power in history. And the coupling of ignorance and political power, that is, the power of the nation state to work its will in the world, I think is something that we ought to be talking about a great deal. As I said, I'd be happy to take questions on anything under the sun. Thank you. Yes.
The remark about your opposing remarks about the young and so on, it strikes me, at least from my own experience, that there's a spillover effect on classroom teaching. Well, I'm not quite sure what the relation is. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I think a lot of students want to be entertained in the classroom, and that if you sort of don't entertain them every minute, they sort of just turn you off. And at the same time, I don't think that I had one student this semester I gave my freshman level course as a class that a chance to pick the issues they wanted to talk about. And one student summed it up by saying, I don't care what we talk about, as long as we don't spend too much time on any issue, all right? So it seems to me that there's a kind of reciprocal relationship here between all the stuff about this sort of approved stuff about the media and our educational system. The bits of information constitute education. people that don't know how to think critically or don't want to. I mean, I think they're really, I think this is a very dangerous threat to democracy because, not just because of the thing about TV, but because of the fact that our educational system, it seems to me, would be rooted in exactly the same kind of craziness that you're talking about. Do you think there's any significant causal relationship between these two?
I do, although I'm always a little bit apprehensive about insisting because I think that all education is full of rhetorical devices, and there's no such thing as the conveying of information which is completely devoid of rhetorical devices. So I don't think there was some sort of golden age when we were collectively dispensing pure knowledge. But nonetheless, I find this extremely ominous, and it's something, interestingly enough, that teachers are always talking about, and that somehow there's never any collective discussion about. I mean, in the middle of the education presidency, when everyone, it's suddenly become kosher to talk about problems of education. In the same year, this guy Chris Whittle starts pumping television news into classrooms, providing satellite dishes for underfunded schools, which they accept because they're being offered something that otherwise they couldn't have. And he's running commercials on the news, and that becomes the big issue, and that's, I think, a legitimate issue. But what never becomes an issue is that what he's running in the guise of current affects education, which teachers are happy to have in their classroom, is this sort of blip news in which a long news piece is 2 minutes. And this is taken to be a gift to education. I think this is tremendously ominous, and let me just mention, you may have seen a couple years ago that the Department of Education, which likes hard social science research, commissioned a study about television and learning. And when it was published in the spring of '88, it got a tremendous amount of press. It was done by a couple of psychologists at the University of Massachusetts. The Associated Press story that ran in the New York Times was headlined, and this was the general tone of how this story was covered. Yes, you too can get A's while watching Family Ties. And the article made it sound like a sort of whitewash, that the article conveyed just what the headline expresses. And I was interested in this, so I sent for the actual report, and I looked up attention span, which is an issue that interests me greatly. And here's in this sort of muffled social science language. Here's what it says about the possibility that television watching affects the capacity to pay attention. As soon as I find the whole thing. Okay, this is a quote, the possibility that rapid pacing may produce effects over longer exposure has not been examined. There does appear to be some effect of audience on attention, yet the importance, generality, and nature of the effect is unknown. Don't you just love social scientists? Intuitively, I have no doubt that this is going on, and I think it is really serious. By the way, you can see it not only in the attention that people can pay to sustained argument, but also in the attention that people are willing to pay to movies. Go see any movie from the early 60s, and you'll be amazed at how long the takes are and how long the scenes are by comparison. And commercials, of course. I mean, today it's quite routine that there be more than one cut per second in a commercial. And of course, the process feeds by. I mean, it is a drug. I mean, television is a drug, and speed is a drug, and speed kills. Yes.
I'd like to make a brief comment and ask a brief question. When you speak about the way in which we elect our national politicians, you should compare it to the way in which these politicians, once in power, make their decisions. They make decisions not because their constituents prove to them the necessity of some action, but because they hire some experienced and well-connected lobbyists who will then obtain the required action regardless of the intrinsic merits of it. So I think the two are coupled, and one cannot understand one without the other. Because just as we have handlers in electing a politician, we have handlers in persuading the politician. That's a common. The question is, if the professional electioneering is really an industry, as you implied at the beginning, is it being exported? I mean, America is
absolutely.
very successful in exporting its best industry. So, in England, you still say that you're standing for office, whereas in America you run for office. Because it changed. In Latin America, where there is now emerging democracy, in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe, where is emerging democracy, are Americans trying to export their methods?
Absolutely, and I'm told that there are noticeable effects on the Thatcher campaigns, that the Thatcher campaigns were professionalized in this way. David Garth, who was one of the first of the media consultants, the sort of guy who's actually depicted very interestingly in an underrated movie called Power, that Sidney Lumet made, which is about political consultants. Garth has been to Venezuela, he's been to Israel, I believe he's been in England. Other outfits were working Hungary this spring during the campaigns. I don't know to what extent this has operated in Canada and in Western Europe, but I'm sure there are some traces of it. It'll be interesting to know whether they still talk about standing as opposed to running. That's a nice point. Yeah.
Early on, you said that the press in America doesn't challenge politicians. They let the politicians set the agenda. And I agree with that. I was wondering if you could give me some insight into why. If you had an explanation for why the press wasn't more aggressive, like the media in general, press, TV. Number two, if we have time, if it's different in other countries, and why it's different.
Okay. The press is quite aggressive. Have you ever watched a press conference live on C-SPAN or CNN? It's worth doing. They're aggressive. I mean, I was sort of amazed the first time I heard Sam Donaldson.
No, but I mean, you said that they don't challenge the framing.
That's the point. There is, there's something deeply. Why is that? Why should they? Why should they?
No, but is it different in other countries?
In fact,
is it something about capitalism? Is it something about
yeah.
who owns the press? Who owns the
No,
media, who owns the
right?
online?
No. In fact, oddly enough, and disconcertingly enough for people like me who are, professionally disgusted by the American press, reporters from other countries are envious of the American press because the American press can do things that they can't do. Okay? The American press has something of a tradition of investigative journalism, of which there is much less abroad. American press has the least confining libel laws of any of the capitalist democracies. In England, people are constantly, reporters and writers are constantly being sued successfully for libel. I know novelists who have feared to publish their own books in Britain because these are basically novels taken from life, and they would end up in court. I've heard English journalists admire the sort of the Watergate discoveries or the Iran-Contra discoveries. The press is much more analytical selectively certainly in France and West Germany, I would say in some respects in Canada. It's more analytical, but it is not more exposing. This is very American. American tradition is pragmatic. It's what works. It's hold the bad guys up to abuse for violating conventionally agreed upon standards. Wait, if a scandal is bad enough, it needs to be reported. Bad enough, of course, is a relative matter. Until it gets bad enough, it's considered boring. The savings and loan scandal was considered boring. The HUD scandal was considered boring. I don't know of another country in which the press is better at this. Okay, maybe arguably some of the Canadian press is better at this, and certainly French, German, some English, some Italian newspapers, I think, are much deeper analytically. I'm not very familiar with the Latin American press, although I think some of the Mexican press is very aggressive in this way. And of course, it's even tougher for them because until very recently, they've been in a one-party society, and journalists have actually been murdered for being too troublesome in Mexico. So, I mean, and of course, the Eastern Europe press, during the Soviet period was not worth discussing on this by these lines. So my criticisms of the American press are not by way of preferring somebody else, in fact, but rather I'm trying to measure the American press by the standard of what we are entitled to if we reclaim democracy. Yes?
You seem really concerned about the important state of media politics in America, and yet you spend about 10 or 15 minutes historicizing the whole thing and say, well, this goes back to 1830 or 1820, people were just as stupid, and they were taken in by just the same kind of showbiz. Why should we be more so worried now?
Because there's more power at our disposal. Because
we're more powerful now?
Because we're a more powerful nation. Certainly, I think one could argue that the damage that was done by Andrew Jackson is without peer in American history, and therefore, in that respect, I wouldn't argue that the press is better. In that respect, I'd have to argue that the press is worse. I wouldn't argue that the press is worse now. I'd say the press is certainly better, because today I don't think you can commit genocide within the national boundaries and not have that fact reported. You can do it elsewhere in the world, and if it doesn't suit American foreign policy, it may not get to be too newsworthy. I want to be critical without positing a golden age. Yeah.
Do you believe the notion that may be backed up by a few surveys that the media is by and large liberal, and if not liberal, 80% liberal, at least liberal, more liberal than conservative, and at least the headlines on the editorial page, if not, obviously they're projected in some of the reporting. And then I have a second question.
Yeah, I think there is, the sociologist Herbert Gans, I think, has looked at this very intelligently in a book called Deciding What's News. From spending a long time hanging out with the staffs of Time and Newsweek and CBS and NBC News, he distilled a list of what he calls enduring news values, that is, the premises that reporters and editors hold basically in the back of their minds, rarely consciously, that govern their sense of how the world ought to be. The world ought to be orderly. The world ought to be mannerly. The world basically is... what happens to educated people is more important than what happens to uneducated people. America is to be seen as a basically pastoral place. Capitalism is to be seen as basically a responsible system. The democratic system we have is to be seen as basically altruistic, and so on. The news media then measure events according to whether they're seen as violating those standards, right? So because rich bankers aren't supposed to be thieves, at a certain point, if enough of them are thieves, and if enough legitimate agencies like the General Accounting Office say that they're thieves, or if congressional investigators say that they're thieves, then the fact that they're thieves becomes newsworthy. Now that's not because the political values of the reporters are what we call liberal today. It's because the enterprise is operating under the conventional idea that news is man bites dog. That is, news is what violates the sense of normalcy. Now that means under certain circumstances, if you like government policy, then you might think that the press are asking too many questions about it, as Reagan did, although not Mr. Darman, who was much more clever. On the other hand, if you don't like government policy, either to left or right, then you are likely to notice the ways in which the press is complicit in American policy. I think it's probably truer to say that with respect to foreign policy, the press largely lets the White House set the agenda and generally accepts the framework in which the White House poses the question. So that, to take the Gulf crisis, for the most part, and there are important exceptions which are not to be minimized, but for the most part, the press has asked the following questions since the troops went to Saudi Arabia. Let me maybe make more sense for me to say what questions the press has not been asking. The press has not been asking why the United States was supporting Saddam Hussein for 10 years. The press has not been asking what is the relevant international law that applies. The press has not been asking what are people, governments, press in other countries saying about the crisis. The press has not been asking why the Europeans and the Japanese who want to pay, or now have been coaxed to pay for this force, haven't been sending their own troops. The press hasn't been asking why the country has been dependent on oil imports. Okay? Now, from my point of view, those are all very important questions. Now, I suppose if you were a down-the-line supporter of the president, then you would be disgruntled about the following things that some people in the press have done. Some people in the press have said that this seems to be all about oil, and do we really want to send American boys and now girls to defend oil? Some people have been asking, some people in the press, and especially in the last couple of weeks as things have simmered down, have been asking why the press itself had been so jingoistic. I heard that word used not on American radio, but on a British radio program that I caught on FM radio in San Francisco from the political editor of Newsweek, Eleanor Clift. I don't think she wrote it in Newsweek, but she said to a British interviewer that she thought the American press had been jingoistic. The same week, by the way, that Newsweek had an endless cover story, which was the most jingoistic thing I've seen during this whole crisis. It was all about, military tactics. So I suppose if one were a down-the-line supporter of the president on this, one would say that the press hasn't lined up clearly enough. Maybe the press has been too quizzical about the fact that Bush stayed in, frantically as it turned out, but still stayed in Maine, and so on. So, but I think it's extremely difficult to make the case that the press has been liberal, because certainly any serious liberal can point out many issues that a liberal would have paid attention to, which the press, in fact, by and large, didn't. But having, bashed the press, I will say that in one respect, from my political point of view, the press has improved in the last quarter century, and that is it has become somewhat more skeptical about itself. As enthusiastic as the press has been for the most part, or I should say rather at least unquestioning about Bush's version of what happened in the Gulf, if you go back and compare coverage of this crisis to coverage of the American attacks on North Vietnam in the wake of the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which was the pivotal incident that gave Johnson his way to escalate the war, an incident that it is now generally understood was fabricated by the American government. There was no skepticism then, zero. The fact that there's any at all is, to someone of my memory, in a slight but noticeable and noteworthy way, remarkable and something to be pleased with. Yeah.
Can you describe the nature of television news as a spectacle? Baudrillard talks about the spectacle then becoming a simulacrum. And in regards to the American public that something was wrong and something was fixed. And how do you see then, in light of the Gulf crisis, and kind of implicit nature between describing some of the news and the government?
Well, you should ask Doug Kellner that question tomorrow night, since he's the Baudrillard man. But I will say that I think in this...
Where is the resistance? Is there possibility?
Yeah, I think it's a nonsensical idea. I mean, I think if I watch pictures of the tanks going into Saudi Arabia, I don't have any doubt that there really is a Saudi Arabia, and there really are tanks. There really is a desert. I don't think that these are all endless copies of texts batting around in free space.
I don't think that the question of is there Saudi Arabia is what they're talking about.
Actually, as a political question, there is some doubt about whether there is a Saudi Arabia, but you know what I mean.
Is there pockets for resistance in television itself? Obviously, you say not to read the newspaper. I mean, that's not a resistant activity. But is
Yeah,
there a way?
good.
Italy
Yeah.
has 3 television networks that are connected each with a separate political party.
No, that's not true.
You know, is that one of the things?
I don't like the language resistance because I think it's overblown. But I think there are dissidences. I don't think it's a seamless system. I think there is friction within it. And I'm always annoyed at people on the left who think that all they have to do is sort of sit back and prove for the 400th time that we're powerless and helpless. When in fact, if some of that energy went into work, to create alternatives and to take advantage of the channels that exist, I think we would be in a healthier ideological climate. That is to say, I think the left has a sort of sad sack attitude, and I don't like it. Certainly there are differences that come out. I mean, I didn't see any on Brinkley's report with Donaldson and Will today, but I have seen it here and there in some of the other media, even in the New York Times. I saw some of it in the Des Moines Register today, although where I saw it was in the letters column, which I recommend to those of you who haven't looked at it today. There are obviously other media systems which have their virtues. The situation in Italy is that the state finance channel is run as a consortium of the 3 leading parties. So each of them gets a piece of it, and they run 2 channels. But again, let's not romanticize other systems. All of the commercial systems in Italy, the commercial systems that were set up because of protest against the monopoly, are controlled by a billionaire real estate tycoon named Silvio Berlusconi, who's madly trying to get his people into Eastern Europe. So again, I mean, I'm deeply critical of the American situation, but the situation, the world mass culture is being Americanized. This is the way it's going. So we have to dig in and, take account of what is and try to move it.
We'd like to take just 2 more questions, then private questions.
Yeah.
Do you think that the greater use of interactive media, but that is greater participation of the audience, will help improve coverage? Will it help improve this attention span? Because once you interact, you have got to see the things properly.
What kind of participation are you thinking of?
In a sense, the audience right now is just receiving images, icons from the screen, okay? But now, if not now, after 10 years or 15 years, very more interactive electronic media will be available. So, audience will be asking a lot of questions. In that case, they will be watching television as they are reading newspaper. This can improve coverage.
Well, I think people should certainly try to avail themselves of the channels that exist. Like the way Doug can tell you about his public access television program, which has been going for 12 years now in Austin. But I'm always wary of what I learned years ago from the wonderful writer Paul Goodman to think of as pseudo-participation. Now on CNN, I think on weekend nights, they will, at a certain point during the major news broadcast at 9 or 10, they tell you that they have the following reports made up, and people should call their 900 number and vote for the piece that they want to see first. I find that really sinister. I think that conveys a phony sense of participation. It's a sort of sense of participation that you get, from being able to, enter trivia contests at Domino's Pizza. or enter the lottery. I mean, I certainly do enter the lottery, but I don't think of it as participating in the effect, in the creating anything important. I think that there are many ways of being involved in media, even without actually being on the screen. I mean, I think that political projects which make demands on reporters are valuable. I think that in fact all political groups should have it as part of their program, their agenda, to propose media policies. I think that the deregulatory era, which by the way was ushered into television not by Ronald Reagan but by Jimmy Carter, is a catastrophe. And that it ought to be part of the political agenda to demand publicly financed public television. It's an outrage that in a country this size we have one, public television network. The simple proliferation of cable channels, of course, doesn't address the problem. So I think that political activity that takes media as a problem is also is extremely important, and I wouldn't think it's a foregone conclusion that we lose on all of those, because sometimes people win. A group of political documentary filmmakers set out to get a piece of public money to finance the making of documentary films, money which was not available anywhere else in American public life, and they did. They testified before Congress. They got Congress to pass a bill, and it's not a whole hell of a lot of money. It's $18 million compared to the unimaginable billions in television, but still it's something. I think that this country ought to have a tax on television sets, which is the British system, British and Canadian, or a tax on the profits of television license holders. After all, a television or radio license, especially television, is a license to print money on a printing press. I mean, you have very low overhead, and these are public licenses. I mean, that is that by law, the airwaves belong to the public. And these people, of course, who are fattening off what they charge politicians, which is especially outrageous, as well as the rest of us, getting $200,000 or $300,000 per half minute, and are not required to give anything back. That money could also be funding public television, and ought to. I think those are political issues that haven't come out. Just one more point about the politics of this. The American broadcasting law operates effectively, though with some changes of the last 10 years, but effectively under the law passed in 1934, the Federal Communication Act, or it was then called Radio Act. And when that was the act that set up the FCC and set up the license system and so on. And also that language, that the airwaves belong to the people, and that ought to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. And when that bill was moved in the Senate, an amendment was moved by your neighbor George Norris of Nebraska and Herbert Lehman of New York, and it would have provided that 1/4 of all these were radio frequencies, be allocated for nonprofit use of farm, educational, labor, religious, and I forget, there was a 5th category of organizations. And that that amendment was defeated by a vote, if I remember correctly, 41 to 24. And it's an amazing thing. I mean, it's tragic that it was defeated, but that you could get 24 members of the U.S. Senate to vote for such a thing, it strikes me as fantastic. I don't think you could get 4 to vote for it today, but it may remind us that it isn't that long ago in American history that issue was debatable. And I think people ought to try to make it debatable again.